Besties, lean in, because what just happened in this case is wild, and the entire internet is buzzing tonight. The legal drama just took a turn that nobody saw coming, and the documents, the arguments, and the judge's sudden ruling have opened a door that someone desperately hoped would stay closed. Stay right here, because the truth behind these sealed files, the privilege fight, and the sudden pushback has created a twist so intense that this might be the moment everything breaks open, and you are not ready for what comes next. The moment this new chapter of the saga began unfolding, the energy across social media shifted instantly, because people could feel that something major was about to erupt. And as the filings started dropping one after another, the atmosphere turned electric, almost like everyone sensed that a storm that had been building for months was finally rolling in. And the shockwaves that followed were enough to make even casual observers sit up straight, because what appeared at first to be a simple dispute over sealed documents suddenly morphed into a high-stakes confrontation that hinted at deeper conflicts and unanswered questions. And as more information surfaced, it became clear that the tension between the parties was now reaching a point where any attempt to keep things quiet was slipping away faster than anyone anticipated. And that is exactly why this moment feels so monumental, because for the first time in a long time, we are watching the layers peel back in real time, revealing details that were never meant to be seen by the public, yet are now forming a trail that suggests the full story is far bigger than anyone expected. And the way it all began earlier today almost seemed routine at first, with a letter here, a response there, procedural moves that typically blend into the background. Yet as soon as the argument started to unfold, the tone changed completely, because these were not casual disagreements. These were conflicting narratives about transparency, urgency, timing, and most importantly, what should and should not remain hidden from public view. And when you place all of that in the context of the growing curiosity around the behind-the-scenes communications, especially those involving messages, emails, drafts, and the mysterious signal conversations that have sparked so much speculation, the stakes become clear, because this is not just a legal disagreement. This is a battle over who controls the narrative and who has the power to shape what the world ultimately learns about the events that took place in the weeks and months leading up to this lawsuit. And what makes everything even more intense is how confidently and directly the arguments were laid out, especially in the response from the Wayfarer side, which wasted no time cutting straight to the core issue: public access to judicial documents, and the principle that evidence relevant to a major case should not remain hidden without a compelling reason. And as soon as that argument hit the record, it sent a signal through the entire discourse. Because if the materials filed under seal are mostly communications that were already used as deposition exhibits or referenced in earlier filings, then the insistence on extended secrecy raised eyebrows not only among legal observers, but among viewers who have been following this case closely, waiting for clarity, and now suddenly watching a push to delay that clarity by weeks, possibly even longer. But what really amplified the suspense was the contrast between the two sides. One arguing that more time was needed to review more than 100 exhibits, the other insisting that the material is straightforward and familiar, and that with multiple legal teams already involved, there is no reason for a delay. And that clash created the exact tension that grips an audience, because it suggests that the urgency is not about time management, but about what might be revealed once the documents become public, and whether that revelation may shift the direction of this entire saga dramatically. And when Alexander Shapiro stepped into the spotlight with her letter, it was impossible to ignore the precision with which she framed the argument. She highlighted the long-standing legal precedent supporting immediate access to summary judgment filings. She emphasized the importance of timely transparency. She pointed out that delays undermine the public's ability to understand the case, and she noted that the Wayfarer side had already offered a reasonable extension, but not one that would expand into weeks of additional secrecy. And that framing set the stage for the most gripping part of this development, because it introduced a question that now hangs over the entire situation. What exactly is in those documents that has triggered such determination to keep them sealed for as long as possible? And this is where the suspense intensifies, because the documents are not described as complicated trade material or proprietary business details. They are described as emails, text messages, and internal communications, the kind of evidence that typically offers glimpses into private conversations, decision-making moments, and the true timeline behind the scenes. And when the public hears that over 100 of these communications were filed under seal in a motion for summary judgment, which is the moment a case tries to bypass a trial entirely, it naturally raises curiosity about which parts of the story these messages support and which parts they contradict. And as Shapiro noted, many of these same documents were already used during depositions, meaning both parties had seen them. But the difference now is that releasing them publicly could shape public understanding in a way that no one can control once the information is out. And that tension is what makes this development feel like a turning point. Because whenever a case reaches a stage where the evidence itself becomes the center of a battle, rather than the legal arguments about the evidence, it usually means the documents contain details that are critical to the narrative and potentially disruptive to the version of events that someone is trying to reinforce. And what makes everything even more dramatic is the way the timeline unfolded earlier today, starting with the request for an extension, then the immediate response, then the judge's intervention, and finally the stunning news about Signalgate resurfacing, which brought an entirely different layer of suspense back into the spotlight. Because Signalgate has been one of the most talked about threads in this entire case, raising questions about digital communication, missing messages, and unclear evidence had all created a narrative that suggested the public might be missing the full picture. And now with the court demanding more detailed privilege logs, specifying participants, senders, and attachments, the tension escalated to a level that captured the attention of everyone following the case. And the focus on privilege logs was critical, because privilege is not automatic. It requires justification. And the more detailed the log, the harder it becomes to assert claims that aren't fully grounded in reality. And that meant that once the Wayfarer parties complied with the new instructions, the content of these communications would be subjected to intense scrutiny. And that scrutiny was likely to reveal information that could dramatically alter public perception of the case. And the anticipation surrounding that revelation kept audiences on edge, because the documents in question included communications involving not only corporate employees, but also legal counsel, discussions about strategy, evidence, and litigation objectives. And the question of which communications qualified as truly privileged and which were merely related to media or PR strategy created a suspenseful ambiguity that was riveting to anyone following the story closely. And it was impossible to notice the way that timing played into this suspense, because as each filing and each court order was issued, the clock was ticking for both parties, and the deadlines imposed by the judge created a pressure cooker atmosphere where every hour and every day mattered. And in this pressure cooker, every procedural detail became a point of tension. Every description in the privilege log became a potential flashpoint for dispute, and every unsealed document held the potential to shift the narrative in a dramatic way. And the way that this all tied back to the larger questions of narrative control was striking, because when a legal case involves high-profile figures and media attention, the difference between what is known publicly and what remains hidden can define reputations, careers, and even public sentiment. And as the judge made clear with instructions to update and supplement the logs, it became apparent that transparency was the guiding principle, and the efforts to obscure or delay information were being systematically challenged. And that challenge was the core of the suspense, because viewers could sense that the truth was about to be exposed, and the narrative, carefully controlled by one side, might be disrupted in ways that no one anticipated. And in the midst of this unfolding drama, the procedural back and forth between motions for extension, responses, objections, and rulings created a rhythm of suspense that kept the audience engaged, and each new filing could either maintain the tension or break it, depending on the content and the tone of the arguments. And the very public nature of this case meant that every move was scrutinized, every nuance analyzed, and every statement in a filing dissected for clues about what might be revealed. And that scrutiny heightened the stakes even further, because when the world is watching,
Legal tactics become public strategy. Every misstep can have consequences, and every assertion can become a headline. And in the middle of all of this, the contrast between Lively's insistence on more time and the Wayfarer team's insistence on immediate access created a dramatic push and pull where the audience was constantly left wondering who would gain the upper hand and whether the court would side with the principle of transparency or an argument for careful deliberation. And that uncertainty fueled the suspense because the ultimate outcome was unclear. And each moment of waiting added to the anticipation. And as the narrative continued to unfold, with references to emails, texts, internal communications, and Signalgate messages, it became clear that this was more than a legal dispute. This was a story about control, influence, and the struggle to manage what information is seen by whom and when. And the meticulous detail in the filings about which documents were already disclosed, which were partially redacted, and which still were
a reality that may finally be impossible to ignore. As the days on set unfolded, the young assistant tried desperately to push aside the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. He told himself over and over that this was part of paying his dues, that maybe